Podcast, a podcast for all movie fans ranging from the biggest blockbusters to hair-raising horror films. My name is Jose Ramos Jr., and if you enjoy talking about movies as much as I do, then you've come to the right place. On today's episode, we will be covering the newest film in A24's productions, The Iron Claw. But before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, J Area Podcast, and follow me on all social media outlets at JustJose_3, and to join the J Area. The Iron Claw follows a wrestling family known as the Von Erichs. It was released last December of 2023, and it is the true story of the inseparable Von Erich brothers who made history in the intensely competitive world of professional wrestling in the early 1980s, with stars such as Zac Efron, Jeremy Allen White, Harrison Dickinson, Stanley Simmons, among others, taking place in the Von Erich family. It's a very interesting and unique take on professional wrestling. Not many stories have been shared in terms of in film. We've had such films such as Mickey Rourke starring in The Wrestler. Of course, there's been other films like the ill-fated Ready to Rumble back in 2000, but there hasn't really been much of attention towards the world of professional wrestling in terms of film. But this story is unlike any other story. It has everything a story in terms of movies would need, in that it has humor, heart, tragedy, triumph. It's not for the faint of heart, if anything, because this story involves a lot of tragedy, which we will discuss. The reason why I decided to release this episode a couple weeks after the release of the film is just to give, viewers an opportunity to have seen the movie already, because this will not be spoiler free. I will be diving into the story itself, and for professional wrestling fans, you would very much be aware of what has occurred throughout the duration of the lives of the Von Erich family. But in terms of the film itself, production had been taking some time prior to its actually commencement. Sean Durkin, who is the director, had always wanted to make this film since he was a fan of pro wrestling growing up, and was personally saddened by the tragedies that would take place within the family. Rather than filming short sequences for matches in this movie, Chavo Guerrero, who served as the primary film's wrestling consultant, he devised the idea of helping prepare the actors for actual full-length matches. These matches would be one take, and it allowed the film to present these matches in a much more subtle, much better flow of things, rather than just being a cookie cutter of each scene. He would teach these actors to build a full-fledged match, if anything. The movie itself really centers the relationship between the brothers. They're very close. They have a relationship that is very much unbreakable. The bond that is demonstrated is felt through all facets of their life, whether it's in the ring, whether it's at home, whether it's with the relationships. You can see Zac Efron, as he's speaking with Lily James's character, Pam. He's very much love for his brothers. All he ever wants to do is just to be around his brothers and to succeed with them. They support one another. They wanted each of them to find their own level of success, whether it was in the business or outside of the business. And Kevin insisted, the actual Kevin Von Erich, not Zac Efron, but the actual Kevin Von Erich, he insisted that if there was one thing he wanted to be included in this film, it was the strong love, the strong bond between he and his brothers. It's a movie, again, that's really solely based on family, devotion, trust, and the loyalty that they demonstrate to one another. Of course, I would be remiss to not mention the life in pro wrestling. It's one of the more tougher lives, and in terms of the mainstream media, a lot of them like to focus on the tragedies, whether it is the addictions, whether it's the injuries, or just the flat-out perception that it's fake. And I know that word kind of irritates a lot of wrestling fans, about it being fake. Yes, it's choreographed. Yes, it's planned. Just like any other television show or television sitcom, things are predetermined and they're not what they seem. However, the physicality and the actions that take place within the ring, for example, getting hit with a chair, that is actually them getting hit with the chair. But this movie in itself really exemplifies and highlights the pressure of living up to the name Von Erich, and in essence just living up to the name of one's father or one's legacy, the pressure to keep climbing up the ladder. Fritz Von Erich, the father of the brothers, wasn't able to fulfill a lot of his dreams in gaining a world championship like he set out to. So he placed a lot of pressure on his boys to basically finish the story and finish his legacy by bringing the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to the family, doing what he couldn't. And of course, it is a physical sport, and although it's predetermined, if not properly trained, one could definitely injure themselves or also injure their opponent. Because essentially, in wrestling, the two competitors, are working together to choreograph a show for the audience. And without that trust and without that bond between the two competitors, it could result in something disaster. We've seen time and time again botches, as they are recognized, occur in the ring and basically result in injury. Some career ending, some in a long term injury that would see them out of action and out of work for quite some time. Another strong theme in this film is fatherhood. Wanting the best for his sons. Fritz was very tough, and we realize this because he realizes that they have the opportunity to do what he couldn't do, as I mentioned, winning that NWA World Championship. And if you place yourself in the position of either Fritz or his sons, I feel like there's this level of understanding. As a father, you want the best for your sons, and you want them to be able to take advantage of the opportunity that is presented in front of them. And also from the sense of Fritz, he worked so hard to build up a legacy, build up a brand, build up a name of the Von Erich name. And now he's able to bestow this upon his sons and not necessarily take advantage of that opportunity, but to use, and for the lack of a better phrase, to use the work that he put forward as a springboard to their own success. If he was able to lay the foundation for them to build upon something even greater, I feel that Fritz would have definitely wanted them to do so. The manner in which he pursues it or expresses his emotions regarding it is questionable, but I think it's fair to say he just wanted his sons to succeed more than he could have. And you can see that from Kevin Von Erich, the oldest, again played by Zac Efron, where similarly to his father, he wants his sons to be happy, but rather than pushing them into the business, he much rather having them stay away from the business, to the point where he wouldn't give them the Von Erich name. He would use his real name, Atkinson, and his sons, Ross and Marshall, would grow up actually to become professional wrestlers themselves, having appeared in All Elite Wrestling and Ring of Honor. And I think I can speak for a lot of wrestling fans where we kind of wish them the best in their careers. The Von Erich family has experienced so much tragedy and so much tribulation throughout the course of their legacy. I think they're definitely due for something good. And to see the relationship that they were able to blossom into, not just in the film, but also through documentaries and through interviews, and you can see that they're just a tight-knit group, and they bond together over these tragedies. Moving forward in terms of wrestling, it really brings the sport to the mainstream. And I feel like, especially with the business at an all-time boom right now, I mean, you look at the way WWE and AEW have been successful in terms of buy rates and pay-per-view buys, and attendance records, the viewerships, the buzz. This film came out at the right time. I think we are at an all-time high in terms of where wrestling is at. It's at its most consumable, it's at its most popular, and it's certainly at its most competitive, with so many different opportunities, so many different outlets for aspiring wrestlers to pursue a career. This film really demonstrates the importance of legacy and the importance of building one's legacy or continuing to build upon one that's already thrusted upon you. Will it affect the public perception? Will it change the public perception? Because a lot of people are still in that sense that it's fake and that it's a waste of time, and that's okay. That's their opinion, and they're entitled to that. And if it's not something they're interested in, then they don't have to expose themselves to that. I know, for example, in this episode, for this podcast, I should say, I focus much more on films and franchises and how they overall impact film. But with this one, I feel like it has an opportunity to impact the sport itself. You're bringing it to a widespread audience, to the point where they were able to incorporate current stars or names that pro wrestling fans would recognize. As I mentioned, Chavo Guerrero was the primary wrestling expert, but he was also in the first wrestling scene portraying the original Sheik. Eagle Eye viewers who are wrestling fans would have been able to identify him, as well as other stars such as the current AEW World Champion MJF appears in a short cameo, very short cameo, blink and you miss it, as Lance Von Erich, who is the fake family member of the Von Erichs and was a way to incorporate another member after the passing of David Von Erich. But I don't know if it's going to change the public perception. I think people who have already had their mind made up, it's very difficult for them to change it. I think not by a film, but by watching an actual event will probably do a better job of not maybe changing their perception, but opening up their mind in terms of what it offers, and especially attending one. When you attend an event with such a live audience and there's such an electricity in an arena, it definitely changes, I feel, the way one feels about the sport itself. But in terms of film, I think this opens up a great opportunity for filmmakers to tackle other stories in terms of the wrestling business. I'm a big fan of biopics and being able to portray one's life. Of course, there are a lot of liberties they may take with the story because they have to make it a little bit more dramatic in the sense of how a film is produced or structured. But if you want something with a lot of meat to the story, I can think of a few names that immediately could have a biopic of their own. Of course, Vince McMahon, who has been in the wrestling business his entire life. His father, ran the WWF, and Vince would then take over. Of course, with all the allegations and the controversies he's been involved with as of late, it might not be the best time, but I do think eventually his story will either be told in a feature film or perhaps even a long-length documentary, and I find either one of those prospects to be very interesting. Hulk Hogan, I know in the past few years, has been rumored to be receiving a biopic of his own. I've seen names such as Chris Hemsworth to be attached to playing him. Again, Hulk Hogan instrumental to the sport itself, and the boom that professional wrestling saw in the 80s was a great deal due to the contributions that Hulk Hogan would provide. But again, outside of the ring, his personal life, especially in the last decade and a half or 2 decades, is an interesting source. But he's remained prevalent in the public eye since the 80s, and he's certainly on that Mount Rushmore of names where if you weren't a wrestling fan, you've at least heard of the name Hulk Hogan. So to have his story be told and shared, I definitely think to a widespread audience could be successful. But the one that I'm mostly interested in and would hope to be told was actually in an interview when they were promoting this film, The Iron Claw, and that is the Guerreros, and more specifically Eddie Guerrero, because his story he has everything you could ask for. His struggle with addiction, his success in the wrestling business, the legacy that he has to follow being a part of such a great and historic and successful wrestling family, and then his road to redemption, being able to finally win the world championship in 2004 and basically fix his reputation, because he had a reputation for not only having his addictions but struggling to stay out of trouble in the WWE in the early 2000s, until finally he goes to rehab and he redeems himself and just leaves a legacy for so many wrestlers and so many aspiring fans of the sport itself. And I feel like no one is as beloved and remembered fondly as Eddie Guerrero, and the legacy that he left behind surely could be told in a major motion picture, with guys like Pedro Pascal, the Mandalorian himself, expressing interests in portraying Eddie Guerrero, and I think that would be amazing casting. They look similar, and the vibe and the energy that Pedro could bring to this role, I think could do the film justice, and would do Eddie justice. But if they decide to pursue that film or not, certainly I think it's something that would be worthwhile and could lead to something successful. But to return to the topic at hand, and that's being the Iron Claw and the Von Erichs, the movie itself I thought was well done. It was well crafted. It's very difficult to cram in a decade's worth of storytelling, within a 2-hour runtime. In the film itself, they kind of not rush through the tragedies, but they kind of combine them where it seems to be happening in succession, one after the other, and that's not necessarily the case. There was a little bit of gap in time between each one. You look at what happened with David in Japan and the accident, and his death, and then Carrie Von Erich having his accident on the motorcycle and resulting in the amputation of his foot. Of course, there's Mike and his inability to really stay healthy in the ring, and his frailness would lead to him having such a difficult time in recovery. I mean, he would go through shock and practically a comatose state, and you could see in his final months and his final time with the family and in the public eye, he wasn't the same. And it's a shame, when someone chooses to, end their life. But that family has been through so much, and I feel like that's why it was important to tell their story, because you could look at it, two different ways, and that it was a bunch of tragedy that happened. And not to mention that they didn't even tell the story of Chris Von Erich, the youngest brother. And filmmakers decided not to go through with that just because it would be too hard or too heavy of content for an audience to watch. I think about Chris Von Erich, though, because his story is very much important to the overall story of the Von Erichs. The way it was explained by filmmakers and others within the film, they described it as, well, we're making a movie. And unfortunately, there's going to be certain things that are going to get cut out, and they won't be kept within the movie. Excuse me. Or you can look at it in the form of a documentary. And if we're going more fact-based, of course, he's going to be included. Of course, all of that story cannot be ignored. So I understand it from that base, but there's just a part of me that doesn't sit right of them excluding Chris. Of course, I understand it, but just because you understand something doesn't mean you have to be a fan of it. I will say for the most part, I'm a fan of the movie itself. The Iron Claw, in terms of its accuracies, is well done. It was nice seeing other wrestlers like Harley Race and Ric Flair, Bruiser Brody, so many names that were prevalent at that time. Gino Hernandez was also included. But to include those names, it really demonstrates just how big the Von Erichs were. And their feud with the Freebirds was also included. So to see that as a wrestling fan and seeing all of these main points in wrestling history being included really warms my heart in a sense. But with the Von Erichs, they have been recognized as one of the first true families in professional wrestling, and they garnered widespread attention in America. They're one of the most significant families in wrestling, reaching the Hall of Fame in 2009. And although recognized for the tragedies of so many brothers passing away, I feel like their true legacy will always be remembered as a loving brothers who wanted to succeed together in the wrestling business. Whether you look at Fritz Von Erich, the father, differently or not, I think the main story is between Kevin, Carrie, David, Mike, and Chris. Unfortunately, Jack Jr. had passed away as a small child, but the bond that these brothers had, I feel like, was infectious in the ring, and certainly the energy that they brought with one another is something I think a lot of siblings should look forward to. I know watching the movie with my siblings, it really projects this level of pride and honor to be able to share moments, share memories with your siblings, and although different circumstances and in a different time, I feel like that love is universal, and you want to be able to see your siblings succeed, just like they would want to see you succeed. And with the Iron Claw, I think it's not only a great film in terms of its accuracies of a biopic, but in a sense, although it does have its darker and mature content for this film, it essentially is a movie about family and what you're willing to do for your family, the sacrifices you're willing to make, the love and loyalty that you express towards your family as well. So one could look at this as a movie about wrestling, but I really think at the front, it is a movie about family, and the family just happens to be involved in the wrestling business. I do think that they should pursue more movies about this kind of content in terms of the wrestling business. Obviously, they're not going to build some kind of cinematic universe like Marvel does, but I do think that there are real stories to be said and real stories to be shared with a widespread audience, And who knows, maybe it'll resonate with audience members like the Iron Claw has. I'm not a member of the Academy, but I would not be surprised if there would be consideration. Would they be nominated? Probably not, but I think it's hard to deny just the level of drama and emotion that this film carries. It's well done in terms of its editing, in terms of its cinematography, its storytelling. Is it movie of the year? No, it's not movie of the year, but I think it's definitely one of those movies that it's worth a watch. And with streaming being available on all facets, whether it's Netflix, Max, Disney Plus, etc., and DVD sales kind of going down because no one's really buying DVDs, this is certainly a film that I will be purchasing to include in my collection, just because of the weight of the story and just the memories I have about talking about the Von Erichs in just their contributions to the wrestling world, as well as being able to educate others about the Von Erichs who may not have as much knowledge as others would. But I highly recommend it. The Iron Claw, now out in theaters, I highly recommend watching this film, whether it is in the theaters, whether it's on streaming. I think it's important to watch if you're a fan of sports, if you're a fan of family, or if you're just a fan of movies. I highly suggest you go out and check out the Iron Claw. But with that being said, if you guys enjoyed this episode of the J Area Podcast, please let me know what you thought about the Iron Claw, or will you be checking out the Iron Claw? And if you are a fan of professional wrestling, what are some of your favorite moments as a fan or attending an event? If you have any suggestions for future movies to revisit, be sure to comment below which ones you would be interested in. You can find me at justjose_3 on about every social media outlet, and be sure to follow this podcast on YouTube and Spotify at the J Area Podcast. If you're not already subscribed, please do so. It really helps out the channel. Go ahead and leave a comment, like, share, just to build the conversation upon even more. And until next episode, my name has been Jose Ramos Jr., and this is the J Area Podcast.